Some haunted houses become famous because of what happened there. Others become famous because people kept coming to see whether anything would happen to them too. Willington Mill belonged to the second kind. Long before ghost hunting became entertainment, visitors were deliberately travelling to a house beside the River Tyne because of what its occupants said was happening inside. The stories were persistent enough to attract skeptics, curious neighbours, and eventually people willing to spend the night, simply to test whether the place deserved its reputation. What makes Willington especially interesting is that the haunting was not built from one dramatic encounter, repeated over generations. It accumulated. Different people, at different times, reported different things, and the family living there began writing those experiences down while they were still happening. By the middle of the 19th century, Willington had become one of the Northwest's best-known haunted houses, and some of the people who went there, hoping to prove otherwise, didn't leave quite as skeptical as they arrived.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Here's a tip for you. There's a podcast out there with fans waiting to be your next customer. They tune in every week, they trust the host, and that host wants to talk about brands like yours in their own words to their audience. The problem is, you just haven't been introduced yet. We're Acast, where that introduction happens. As the world's largest podcast marketplace, we let you browse shows, see who's listening, and book host-read sponsorships or run your own ads, all from one platform. Transparent pricing, real-time data, complete control. Start advertising on podcasts by visiting acast.com/advertise.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Thumbtack presents Uncertainty Strikes. I was surrounded. The aisle and the options were closing in. There were paint rollers, satin and matte finish, angle brushes, and natural bristles. There were too many choices. What if I never got my living room painted? What if I couldn't figure out what type of paint to use? What if I just used Thumbtack? I can hire a top-rated pro that knows everything about interior paint, easily compare prices, and read reviews. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.
Hello, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Towie.
And welcome to the Whispering Woods Haunted episode. In this episode, we are going to
Newcastle upon Tyne.
We're staying in the UK, up to Newcastle. I'll get straight into it. Are you ready for the story?
Yes, I am.
Willington Mill once stood beside the River Tyne, several miles east of Newcastle, in what was then a busy industrial landscape of mills, workshops and growing communities. Beside the mill itself was a substantial house, occupied during the 19th century by Quaker businessman Joseph Proctor, his wife Elizabeth, and their children. For years there was nothing particularly remarkable about living there. Then the noises began. At first they were easy enough to dismiss. Footsteps in rooms that should have been empty, knocks coming from inside walls, and movements overhead when nobody was upstairs. But as the disturbances continued, other members of the household began experiencing them too. Servants heard unexplained sounds. Visitors reported beds moving beneath them. And figures were occasionally seen inside the house and at its windows. Joseph Proctor began keeping notes. By the time the haunting had been going on for several years, he believed that dozens of people had witnessed something they could not explain. Word of the house spread beyond Willington, eventually reaching people who wanted to see for themselves whether there was anything behind the stories. One of them was a young surgeon named Edward Drury. Drury was not particularly interested in simply accepting somebody else's ghost story. In the summer of 1840, he asked Joseph Proctor for permission to spend a night inside the house and investigate it himself. On 3rd of July, Drury arrived at Willington with a companion, Thomas Hudson. Before settling down for the night, the two men searched the house and secured the rooms, leaving Drury satisfied that nobody was hiding inside who might be responsible for the disturbances. Apart from Drury and Hudson, only Joseph Proctor and a servant remained in the building. Shortly before midnight, the house became quiet. Then somebody began walking upstairs. A few minutes later came knocking, followed by something Drury described afterwards as a hollow cough. The two men remained where they were, listening as the sounds moved around them. Shortly before 1 o'clock, Drury glanced at his watch. When he looked up again, a cupboard door appeared to open. Standing beside it was a woman. She was dressed in greyish clothing, with her head bent down and one hand held against her chest, as though she were in pain. Her other arm hung towards the floor, one finger pointing downwards, and instead of remaining beside the cupboard, she began moving slowly across the room. Hudson had apparently begun to doze beside him. The figure continued towards them. Drury did not stay in his chair. He rushed directly at the woman, apparently intending to seize whoever had entered the room. But instead of catching hold of anyone, he gave a terrible yell and collapsed across Hudson. According to the account he wrote only days later, much of what happened after that disappeared from his memory. He was carried downstairs in a state of extreme fear and remembered almost nothing clearly for several hours. 10 days later, Edward Drury put the experience into writing, and by then, he was only one of many people who claimed to have encountered something inside the haunted house at Willington Mill. What makes the incident unusual is that his letter was not produced decades afterwards as part of a local ghost story. It became part of a published account of the haunting in 1842, while the people involved were still alive, and while the disturbances at Willington were still being discussed. Newcastle University's Special Collections now holds a copy of the pamphlet, entitled Authentic Account of a Visit to the Haunted House at Willington, near Newcastle upon Tyne. By then, however, Edward Drury represented only one witness. Joseph Proctor claimed that roughly 30 people had experienced things at the house that he could not satisfactorily explain, including members of his own family, servants, mill workers and visitors. There were reports of footsteps crossing empty rooms, violent knocking, beds moving beneath their occupants, and figures appearing both inside the building and at its windows. And the strange events had begun years before Drury ever decided to spend a night there. Willington Mill stood close to the River Tyne, between Wallsend and North Shields, beside the narrow waterway known as Willington Gut. The flour mill itself was an impressive industrial building, rising several stories above the surrounding site, and powered by steam at a time when this was still relatively unusual in the northeast. It had originally been owned by the Unthank family, and in 1829, their cousin Joseph Proctor, a Quaker businessman, became involved with the operation. The substantial house adjoining the mill contained around a dozen rooms, spread across 3 floors, and eventually became home to Proctor, his wife Elizabeth, and their growing family. There was apparently already a story attached to the house before the Proctors began experiencing anything themselves. Joseph later recorded that his cousin had told him the building, and one room in particular, had once been regarded as haunted. The Unthanks, however, had occupied the property for approximately 25 years, without encountering anything they considered supernatural, and the old reputation seems to have been little more than local gossip by the time the Proctors arrived. There were also rumours that some unspecified act of violence had taken place while the property was being built, although surviving 19th century accounts provide no clear victim, crime or evidence for what was supposed to have happened. For a considerable period, the Proctor family also lived there without incident. Then noises began coming from an upstairs room. At first they were sufficiently ordinary that there was little reason to think of ghosts. Members of the household heard movements overhead and sounds resembling somebody walking across the floor. Yet whenever the room was checked, there was no obvious cause. The disturbances returned on different nights, sometimes faintly, and sometimes loudly enough to wake people elsewhere in the house. Early in 1835, Joseph recorded one particularly clear episode while he and Elizabeth were in bed. Somewhere very close to them came the repeated sound of what he compared to a mallet striking a block of wood, perhaps 10 or 12 blows in succession. Nothing was found to explain it. The following night there was another disturbance. Joseph was putting his infant son into his cradle when he heard indistinct noises coming from the room above. Then something apparently struck or tapped the child's cradle with a metallic sound powerful enough to make it vibrate. There was nobody visible beside it who could have produced the blow. The noises did not remain confined to the family. One night, at around 1 o'clock, Thomas Mann, a foreman at the mill, was working nearby and went into the yard to collect coal. He suddenly heard a loud scraping or grinding noise across the cobbled ground. A wooden cistern, mounted on wheels, was kept there for carrying water to the mill horses. A man believed somebody was moving it. Expecting to catch a thief, he hurried towards the sound. The cistern had not been moved. Nobody was in the yard. Joseph would later record hearing footsteps outside the house, apparently travelling across the gravel when there was nobody there to make them. Similar footsteps would eventually become one of the most frequently reported features of the haunting, sometimes heard outside and sometimes crossing rooms inside the building. The disturbances gradually began reaching other parts of the house, and members of the Proctor household were no longer simply hearing an unexplained noise occasionally coming from one troublesome room. Servants began experiencing things for themselves. Visitors heard movements in empty parts of the building, and on some nights, the sounds appeared to travel. The bedrooms produced some of the most unsettling incidents. Two of Elizabeth Proctor's sisters were staying at Willington when the bed they shared suddenly began shaking violently. The curtains surrounding it were pulled or lifted upwards towards the tester above them and then dropped again, only for the movement to be repeated. Rather than abandon the room, the women removed the curtains before going to bed the following night. That night, they saw something. According to the account later recorded by the Society for Psychical Research, a female figure of a greyish-blue colour appeared to emerge directly from the wall behind the head of their bed. It moved towards them and leaned over where they were laying, close enough for both women to see it clearly, before withdrawing again into the wall from which it had appeared. Another female visitor had an experience in one of the bedrooms while tidying the room. She noticed what appeared to be a white towel lying near the dressing table and moved towards it, apparently intending to pick it up. As she approached, the object no longer resembled a piece of cloth. What she had taken for a towel appeared instead to rise or transform into a figure, producing another of the strange visual encounters increasingly associated with the house. By now, the number of people experiencing things at Willington was growing well beyond Joseph and Elizabeth themselves. There were also occasions when whatever was being seen could apparently be observed from outside. On one evening, several people standing near the mill noticed a figure at an upper window of the house. The witnesses included a woman connected with the Proctor family and a mill employee accompanied by his wife and daughter. They watched what 19th century accounts described as a luminous human form moving backwards and forwards behind the glass. It remained there for several minutes. The figures appeared bareheaded and dressed in something resembling a white surplice. Witnesses described it as partly transparent and unusually bright, seeming to give off its own light rather than simply being illuminated from inside the room. As they watched, its appearance gradually changed, becoming dimmer and taking on a bluish colour, before finally fading away from the head downwards. Word spread through Willington and the communities surrounding the Tyne that strange things were happening in Joseph Proctor's house, while more people began asking permission to visit the property for themselves. Proctor was initially reluctant to encourage the attention, but the number of witnesses continued to increase, and eventually the stories reached people who had no connection with either his family or the mill. One of them was a young surgeon from Sunderland named Edward Drury. Unlike many of the people already discussing Willington, Drury did not approach the story as someone convinced that houses could be haunted. He wanted permission to spend the night there because he did not believe it. Edward Drury had heard about Willington from people whose judgment he trusted, including a friend named Mr. Davison, but he remained doubtful that anything supernatural was taking place. During the summer of 1840, while the Proctor family were expected to be away from home, he wrote to Joseph asking permission to spend a night inside the house and investigate the disturbances for himself. His original intention was to go alone, although when he eventually arrived on 3rd of July, he brought Thomas Hudson with him. He also carried a brace of pistols, not because he expected to shoot a ghost, but because he suspected that someone connected with the mill might try to frighten him, and decided he would make it clear that practical jokes would be a very bad idea. Once he had met Joseph and inspected the property, however, he decided there was no need to load them. The inspection was thorough. Drury and Hudson were allowed to search the rooms and examine the parts of the house from which the noises had been reported, including the largely unfurnished upper floor where they intended to keep watch. Particular attention was given to the small cupboard connected with the later apparition, but Drury concluded that it was too shallow for somebody to conceal themselves inside it. With the door secured and the building searched, the two men settled onto the 3rd-story landing shortly before 11 o'clock. Drury began the vigil expecting that every sound would eventually have an ordinary explanation, but the sequence that followed changed his opinion of the house considerably. After hearing the unexplained movements around the landing, he eventually saw the female figure that had caused his collapse, and the experience affected him so badly that he remembered almost nothing clearly for several hours afterwards. 10 days later, once he'd returned to Sunderland, he wrote directly to Joseph Proctor and provided the account that would eventually become the most famous testimony associated with Willington. Drury's visit did not bring the disturbances to an end, and it was not the only attempt to establish what was happening inside the house. More visitors came, while the Proctors continued recording incidents involving both family members and servants. One recurring sound was described as something extremely heavy, falling from the top of the building and passing downwards through each successive floor, producing a violent thump every time it appeared to strike another level. On other occasions, the kitchen sounded as though its contents were being dragged around or thrown from place to place, only for Joseph to go downstairs and find the room undisturbed. The family became sufficiently accustomed to this particular performance that the unseen source of the commotion was simply referred to as a ghost. Voices were heard as well. On one occasion, Elizabeth Proctor called for the children's nurse and heard an answer apparently coming from the nursery, although when she entered the room, nobody was there, and the nurse was outside the house. One of the Proctor children later remembered hearing what seemed to be the same woman moving around an empty room, and discovered that she was not even inside the building at the time. The children had experiences of their own. One of Joseph's young sons repeatedly complained that something was getting underneath his bed and pushing it upwards. He described the sensation in the language available to a child, saying that it felt as though a large dog had crawled underneath and was lifting him from below. Similar movements had already been reported by adult visitors, and throughout this period, the strange pattering of small feet continued in the upper part of the house. For the domestic servants, the situation appears to have become particularly difficult. They heard and saw enough unexplained activity that some became frightened of remaining in the house, and the Proctors reportedly went through servants more frequently as a result. Joseph continued collecting names and experiences. In the account published in 1842, he stated that he had around 30 witnesses to occurrences he believed could not satisfactorily be accounted for. While a later 19th century history, based partly on information supplied by one of his sons, put Joseph's claimed total as high as 40. By the middle of the decade, however, something began to change. The disturbances became less frequent. The Proctors remained at Willington until 1847, by which time they'd lived with the reputation of the haunted house for more than a decade. Eventually, the family left the property altogether, bringing their own long involvement with the Willington ghost to an end. One 19th century account later stated that the phenomena faded entirely when the mill clerk, foreman and their families occupied the premises afterwards, although other local histories preserved reports of strange experiences associated with the site much later. The mill was sometimes called Kitty's Mill, and later folklore attached the name Kitty to a female ghost, supposedly connected with a fatal accident on the site. Other stories introduced animal apparitions as well, including phantom dogs, cats, and even a strange tabby, said to have been seen inside the furnace room. These belonged largely to the later folklore surrounding Willington, rather than the detailed incidents recorded by Joseph Proctor. The Tyne and Wear Historic Environment record notes that Victorians came to regard the mill as one of the most haunted buildings in the north.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Thumbtack presents Tile Trouble. Every single time I use my sink, I make eye contact with the uneven grout on my kitchen backsplash. The crooked corners eye me, and I'm haunted by more tiling questions than I thought possible. What kind of pro can fix a backsplash? Can I replace one cracked tile, or should I replace them all? What if I just use Thumbtack? I can hire top-rated pros, read reviews, and compare prices with a tap, all on the app. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.
One of those places I'd love to visit, but I can't anymore because it's not there.
Yeah, I'm alright on visiting there, to be fair.
Yeah, you don't want to? You wouldn't want to?
Nah.
What, even if it still stood?
Yeah, I know.
You would if it was abandoned though, wouldn't you?
That's probably even creepier.
Yeah, but you love that abandoned stuff, don't you? Bit
Yeah.
urban exploring.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. As long as I got some defence.
And someone with you.
Yeah.
Not going on your own.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch up with you again soon.
We will indeed. We'll catch you tomorrow for the main episode. Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.
Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Thumbtack presents Tile Trouble. Every single time I use my sink, I make eye contact with the uneven grout on my kitchen backsplash. The crooked corners eye me, and I'm haunted by more tiling questions than I thought possible. What kind of pro can fix a backsplash? Can I replace one cracked tile, or should I replace them all? What if I just use Thumbtack? I can hire top-rated pros, read reviews, and compare prices with a tap, all on the app. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.
They don't realize smart people use smartphones, huh? Download text now. Pay what you want or not at all. Show these ridiculous carriers we're way too smart to pay dumb.
Free app-based talk and text via the Text Now app. Requires Wi-Fi or data connection. Data plans sold separately. 5G where available.
The stories told on the Whispering Woods are inspired by historical records, witness reports, and local folklore. While every effort is made to research and represent events accurately, some details, names, and locations may differ from official accounts or have been changed out of respect for those involved. These episodes are created for storytelling and entertainment purposes and should not be considered definitive fact or investigative journalism.